starting this second session of our forum, of our category of the forum. And we'll be talking, shifting from geopolitical and international relations analysis to mostly sociocultural and sort of civilizational aspects of IR. Hopefully you will enjoy it. Thank you. My colleague James will introduce the guests.
Okay, welcome to the final international relations panel. From universalism to particularism, civilizational and cultural drivers of change in the international system. We have a great panel lined up to pick up on the conversation that we had yesterday. Joining us, Professor David Gibbs of the University of Arizona, Bryce Green, media critic for FAIR, and a student and organizer at Indiana University. Artur Moini is the director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy in the United States. Paul Grenier is the president and founder of the Simone Weil Center for Political Philosophy. Right behind me is Matthew Blackburn, senior researcher for Russia, Asia, and international trade at NUPI. And we'll be joined online soon by a number of guests, including Scott Horton, who's a radio and podcaster from Texas, and Almut Rojakonski, who's a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So we'll get things started.
So we are shifting to, everyone can hear me, right? Okay. So we are shifting, just a few minutes ago we had a discussion on international relations from a more traditional perspective, from the, analyzing international system, balance of power, multipolarity. And this time we're going to be discussing the changing environment in terms of sort of civilizational terms, in terms of sociocultural aspects of that change, and how it affects domestic societies, and whether or not we are witnessing the coming of the end of sort of this neoliberal, postmodernist, so many names for these things now, era, and mostly sort of a shift towards particularism and sort of cultural autonomy, if you will. And I would like to start out by just basically asking a simple question to the panelists. How do you think there is with the change of, with this change that we are witnessing in the international system, what are some of the cultural changes that we are also witnessing in parallel to this? And is the world going to be mostly my culture versus the other cultures, and this whole universalist, tolerant human rights approach is coming to an end? Professor Gibbs, please get started on that. Yep.
Well, yesterday I spoke on the how there was an opportunity for a more peaceful world after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And instead we had the rise of, at least for a while, unipolar U.S. hegemony. Today I'm going to discuss, shall we say, the cultural, ideological aspect of that, which is the rise of humanitarian intervention and the discourse of human rights as a justification for intervention. In particular, the very seminal role played by the breakup of Yugoslavia in that process. Just a few details here is that Yugoslavia, of course, had been a federation, multi-ethnic federation that broke up in 1991, roughly at the same time as the Soviet Union. And in the context of that breakup, you had two major civil wars in the former Yugoslav republics. In the mid-90s, you had an extended, almost 3-year civil war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then towards the end of the decade, another war in Kosovo. And the resolution of those two wars played a key role in not only giving a new enhanced power to U.S. hegemony and NATO, but also, very importantly, to kick off the idea of humanitarian intervention as an ideological justification for U.S. hegemony and for NATO, very importantly. A few details about the, well, in the first place, one of the things that's very striking about the war, first in Bosnia-Herzegovina, was the extent to which this easily could have been prevented or stopped early on through negotiations, but that was blocked by the United States, which insisted it had to be resolved only through military intervention, and that negotiations were an unacceptable way to achieve resolution, setting a precedent that was essentially seeing negotiations in negative terms and military force as a positive alternative to negotiations. Specifically, in 1992, the three ethnic groups were brought together by the European Union in Lisbon, and actually then called the European Community, the EC had brokered a tentative agreement among the three ethnic groups involving devolution of power to the local level that was accepted in preliminary form by all three ethnic groups. What happened then was the United States ambassador approached the Bosnian, the Muslim, and the Croatian ethnic groups and told them they really shouldn't sign the agreement in final form, that they would receive U.S. backing, and with U.S. backing they could prevail on the battlefield, and they would need to make no concessions. After that, the talks broke down completely and war commenced immediately. Over the next almost 3 years, as I said, there was a 3-year vicious war with horrific atrocities, including the very famous Srebrenica massacre, killing 8,000 people. In the context over those almost 3 years, the nations repeatedly tried, under David Owen, a former British foreign minister, to again try and bring a resolution of the war, building upon the precedent that had been set in Lisbon of a deal that divided Bosnia-Herzegovina into ethnic localities and devolved power to the ethnic localities. But the main impediment to those negotiations was the United States, which kept objecting that the negotiations were amoral, we shouldn't make concessions to the amoral side seen as the Serbs. As a result of the sort of the moral high-mindedness of the Americans, the war continued and dragged on far longer than it had to. This is very clear, by the way, if you read the memoirs of David Owen. He explicitly states that one of the main impediments he faced was U.S. diplomacy, which always was torpedoing his efforts. The war was finally settled by military intervention. The United States and its allies managed to arm the Muslim and Croatian forces, which were able to go on an offensive backed by a NATO air campaign against the Serbs, defeating the Serbs on the battlefield, resulting in a peace agreement in Dayton, Ohio, mediated, of course, by the Americans, that looked remarkably like, hardly distinguishable from, previous EU and UN peace proposals that the United States had torpedoed. The main objective here was being to give NATO a new lease on life, a new function, a new justification, and also to make sure the European community and the UN would not compete with the US for power. American officials in their memoirs, by the way, are very frank that finding a new justification for NATO was one of the main accomplishments of the US role in the Bosnia War. In Kosovo, I won't have time to go into that because I'm running out of time, had a very similar resolution, which was basically that the war was very nearly prevented by negotiations brokered by Britain and France. The US torpedoed those negotiations, resulting in a NATO air campaign, defeating Serbia on the battlefield, and again, giving new power and justification to NATO, which was probably the objective all along. The main function of this was to demonize the idea of negotiations and to give a certain tone of moral self-righteousness to future interventions. The idea is you don't negotiate with the side that's in the wrong. You defeat them on the battlefield. Negotiations with the bad guys, if you'll permit me to use that phrase, is amoral. And because it's amoral, military defeat is what is necessary. And American power is necessary to achieve that military defeat. As much as possible, doing that power through NATO, dominated, of course, by the United States. Increasingly, what you got out of the Bosnia and Kosovo cases was a kind of almost religious tone here, which is that America has a moral mission, a humanitarian mission in the world, okay, to protect minority ethnic groups from persecution, to protect women from persecution, to protect various other groups from persecution, and to do it through military force. And this really had a remarkable and galvanizing effect among intellectuals. I don't think it ever really had much resonance among ordinary people in the United States, but among intellectuals, in the media and academia, it had enormous influence. And the idea of humanitarian intervention transformed discussion of intervention, and whole groups in the United States that had been anti-interventionist, the human rights community, for example, the political left, the women's movement, were now converted en masse to the idea that war is not a bad thing, war is a good thing, because it achieves positive humanitarian objectives. It's interesting to note that during the Cold War, one group that was always very skeptical of intervention were women, who are less warlike than men. Polls showed this. This disappeared in the 1990s as some of the most warlike and pro-war figures became women, people like Samantha Power. In Europe, people like Ursula von der Leyen. And I think it was the experience in Yugoslavia that transformed discussion of this. And so I think that Yugoslavia had a key role, basically, in setting the tone. One more thing that the Yugoslav did, it resulted in the personalization of conflict. That what was the source of the problem in Yugoslavia? It was one person, Slobodan Milosevic, okay, who became the epitome of evil. It was the revival. In history, we tend to disparage and ridicule the great man theory of history as an oversimplification, but we had a remarkable renaissance of the great man theory of history in the form of the great villain of history, in the form of Milosevic. Fast forward to today, we see almost exactly the same narrative playing out in Ukraine. Everything that's going on in Ukraine is the result of one man, Vladimir Putin. We have a humanitarian objective to defeat Russia on the battlefield, not to compromise a negotiation. That's immoral. We see once again the religious tone, almost a missionary kind of style, that is impervious to logic or argument. That precedent was set in Yugoslavia. And so Yugoslavia really, I see, had a major ideological function in laying the groundwork for U.S. hegemony after the Cold War.
Thank you, Professor. I think Colonel Wilkerson also made that point. A few months ago, I remember him on one of the platforms, finding purpose for NATO, which you were talking about, and whole Yugoslavia bombing and all. So, but thank you very much for your insight.
So
and as a reminder, we also have two guests on Zoom waiting for us. So let's keep that in mind, and then we'll give them the word as well.
Okay. Oh, that's great that they're online. New sort of systems of cultural values do we see coming to the fore, or is it going to be a fragmentation of cultural values,
yes,
or is it going to be consolidation? You're working on the assumption that we have a certain liberal universalism that was the order, sort of a global civilization, and now is it fragmenting, or
correct?
Or
is it being challenged by
particularism,
by right, sort of cultural autonomy and even nationalism, if you will? I mean,
right. But I think that what I'm trying to, I think it's worthwhile to connect that issue with the issue of the weakening and the challenges to democracy everywhere, which we see popping up all over the place. And when I was thinking of this, it always reminds me of the work of the Harvard sociologist, it's kind of a philosopher of sociology, Barrington Moore, who wrote some really interesting works probably 50 years ago that are related to this topic. Because he made a point which also occurs to me in precisely this context, that in a sense, democracy is a very good system for making decisions about things that are trivial. And that's a somewhat exaggerated form. It's not necessarily trivial in terms of the way people live their lives. It's not trivial to me how much taxes I pay. It's important. And so, but it's not about the existential issues about what it means to be a human being. You don't do that.
Correct.
You don't talk about those things at that level. You don't talk about whether, frankly, in my humble opinion, as I know, 3 years ago in Georgia, it would have not been polite to say this, but democracy is not really the forum in which you decide whether marriage is between a man and a woman or between a man and a man. That's an existential issue. Those are civilizational defining issues. And if people disagree about those things, they're living in different civilizations. And if you're living in different civilizations, then you're not, the democratic process is simply inadequate for those kinds of things. So I think that's the big part of what of what we're going about. We have a crisis of democracy because we have a crisis of these existential issues that we don't agree on. And I won't develop the thought, but I mean, if you look at Trump and the people around Trump, I know that you're interested in that, Lasha, as well, from a civilizational aspect, there's not a lot of clarity there, or in his coalition, about that there's a certain protest against the old order, but there isn't a real consolidation around a new cultural value system. And just one other quick comment. You'll probably, if you haven't already in Georgia heard about, you probably will be hearing soon about people who are protesting against the idea of democracy in America, such as Curtis Yarvin. He's become like the, I don't know if the word bête noire means anything in translation, but he's a new person who's being demonized, and partly, perhaps properly so. He's kind of weird, but he's a very prominent now American cultural political voice who's blatantly saying democracy is already dead. It doesn't solve any real problems. He's pointing to the sorts of things like, we had a president who was basically on the beach for 4 years when he wasn't asleep under Biden, and nobody noticed that we didn't have a president. Why did that happen? Because basically we have an oligarchic bureaucracy that runs America, and that runs the world, and there's no individual who actually takes responsibility for anything. They screw everything up, and no one ever is punished, and nothing ever happens. And Americans en masse notice this and are angry about it. But Yarvin's response is, the hell with democracy. CEOs work in big corporations work perfectly well as monarchs. Why don't we just have a CEO monarch and call it a day and get rid of democracy? That's not my position at all. I think it's interesting that Yarvin is making those points. And Yarvin is not an idiot. He'd be worth having come here and have a discussion with. I'd be happy to debate him if you want to bring him. But
it would be wonderful.
But the thing is that he's pointing out an actual problem that's real. But what we need, in fact, what we need though is a philosophical engagement to look at these cultural issues in depth and come to a new consolidation that makes sense, and then continue with democracy.
Thank you. Arta, go ahead.
Myths. And I think some of them is just baked into the common language now. The way that we think about some of these issues is through terms like fragmentation, globalization. And I think our perception itself comes from the post-war order to such a point that we have developed a globalist cognitive bias. Almost everything we do is through a reified picture of the world. It means that we think that this world is something that exists. The world doesn't exist in our day-to-day actions. Localities exist, neighborhoods exist, the land that you walk on exists. Rootedness exists. What we think about when you think about this word that I hate so much, international community, it doesn't exist. What we need to understand is that these are all idealistic postulates of a particular time period that was put over us, and we continue to think in those universal terms, even if we want to challenge back against what comes with that. So that's number one. So I think globalization was always an unnatural byproduct of an aberration in history, of an aberrant time, an anomalous time in history, which is the post-war order. So that post-war order was effectively nothing but a very situational development through which we got both the bipolar moment and the unipolar moment. And both were brief in historical terms. We are now going back to a much more natural understanding of the world that is made in the regions. And we need to understand the importance of that locality and region once more. With that comes, I believe, three different ways where we can actually see, and we can discuss this further, but I'm just going to very briefly say that this actually is not, in one group versus another group kind of thing. That this globalism, this globalist cognitive bias affects all sides of the conversation, whether they call themselves realists, they call themselves liberals, they call themselves opponents of liberals, doesn't matter. So for example, the first kind of dominant understanding of globalism and even internationalism that we know is the sort of the idea of liberal hegemony, that we can remake the world in our image, that we have the right values, that global homogeneity is basically the ultimate goal. That's the idea of the end of history, and it's the organizations as well as, let's say, the paradigm itself of internationalism that works within that fabric, a humanitarian idea that was mentioned, international law, human rights. All of these concepts are abstract concepts. They're legalistic and formalistic by definition and product of a specific time period. Again, I go back to the fact that they were always, despite the claim towards end of history even as their ultimate goal, they were always historical and in transition. And what we are seeing right now is an unraveling of that framework, because part of the redistribution of power, part of the sort of multi-polarity that was discussed is that more and more powers, more and more civilizational actors can use their own background, their own intellectual traditions to challenge the interpretation of the very same law. That's why we have the crisis, the normative crisis that we have, looks like a crisis in the moment. So because everybody can challenge and interpret the laws, the international laws, we actually see that they were not, there was nothing concrete in them. We see this playing out in Yugoslavia, but we also see it in Ukraine, right? So what happened in Yugoslavia, the way that we went to justify NATO action in Yugoslavia, well, that's exactly what Putin learned and used as a justification for going after Ukraine. So again, interpretation of the law actually shows that that the differences have always been foundational. Now, moving away from the liberal camps to the realism, right? People who call themselves realists. There was a question that was mentioned about what realism tells us. And I think if we think about sort of IR realism itself has also been very grounded in utilitarian thinking, in a very narrow understanding of rationality, which again sees the sort of the plane of action as the world itself. So if you want to feel really secure, you have to dominate the entire world. That premise itself is again a foundationalist, abstract, almost mythological idea, and yet we think of it as rational. Throughout history, many cultures, many civilizations, many powerful actors did not believe that they need to expand and dominate the world and achieve global hegemony in order to have peace and security. And ultimately, even the unique thinkers of the 1990s, such as Samuel Huntington, who thought in a different way, not liberal, not realist, but civilizationalist, let's say. The idea of civilization that Huntington brought about was also tinged by this globalism, because the way that he defined civilizations at the time was highly reductive to one aspect of civilizations, one aspect of culture, which was religion. And so if you reduce that to just religion, it means that you're actually promoting, this is a clash between various universalisms. It's not a clash of various ideologies in the way that we can see, which is a secular formation, but it's a clash of various beings in the world that all want to be the one way of existence. So in that sense, it was globalist, and even today, many people want to give homage to Huntington and use him to say, for example, this idea of the Western civilization. The Western civilization is under threat because of the war in Ukraine. The Western civilization is under threat for this and that cause. This mythological, again, idea of the Judeo-Christian civilization, which again, it's a to me nonsensical concept. So these exist because they give an illusion of the civilized versus the barbarian.
Right.
So that's, again, universalist. But, and hopefully we can talk more later about what a more healthy conception of civilization, which is grounded in multiplicity and particularity, look like, that is not so taken over by universalism and globalist cognitive bias.
Thank you very much, Art. That is great points. I think our virtual friends are getting a little impatient here, so let's get started. Almut, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can everybody hear me there?
Great. Pascal, I think you'll have to wait for a little longer, okay? Just hang in there. All right, thank you both for being with us. We really appreciate it. And Almut, you can get started. Do you want me to sort of pose a question, or you want to get, you know...
the question was about universalist culture. Is it coming to an end, right?
Sure.
I'm
And maybe
happy to talk
somehow...
about that.
Maybe somehow you can also involve NGOs in that. I don't know. Maybe you can figure it out. But please, yes.
Okay, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm gonna start by telling you a story today, and this is a real story about my own life. This is some years ago. It was like a few years before the pandemic. I was at a summer school in southern Italy, in Calabria, and I walked into a Western Union office there. And all the flyers on the wall were in Georgian, and a lot of the clients there were middle-aged Georgian women. And this is a story that you're not going to hear much about on this panel anyway. I think on other panels at this conference, where you have more Georgian speakers and more women speakers, you will be hearing about it. And this is actually the story that I do want to talk about, is that we can talk here about, like big words like, universalist versus civilization, whatever. Georgia is going through a profound crisis. It's going through multiple crises. And one of them is actually catastrophic, that in the last 30, 35 years, it has lost about a third of its population. And it hasn't lost its population due to low birth rates, because Georgia actually has birth rates above replacement level. It has lost it mostly to high labor migration, and a little bit also to like high mortality, excess mortality. And this labor migration is to a very large extent middle-aged women who leave behind their families to go to Europe, very often to Italy, including southern Italy, Calabria, where they work for something like 800 euros a month in the homes of wealthy middle-class Italians watching their elderly relatives, instead of taking care of their own families. Losing 30% of your population is catastrophic. It's like what Germany went through during the 30-Year War, or England during the Black Death of the 14th century. And we're not talking about this here. And I think, so when we look at Georgia today, this is a country that hasn't just engaged very actively and very enthusiastically and very dynamically with the cultures and ideas of the hegemon of the moment. And Georgia has done that really well. Like, it really engages critically, not just at the elite level, but also at the broader societal level, with new ideas that are coming into this country. That has been the secret of its survival, and the secret of whenever Georgia has been successful, it has been because it has been so open to engaging with others, excuse me, and taking on from them. But what Georgia has done over the last few years is it has also imported culture wars, right? It is just like it has imported Western cultural hegemonic ideas, it has also imported the culture wars. So in summer in Georgia, over the last decade, we've seen sort of this tension between events that celebrate pride and the rights of LGBT people, and then opposed to that, events that celebrate family, supposedly. So, and both sides try to bring as many people as possible out on the streets. And here's the thing, this is not helping anybody. You can bring tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Georgians out in the street in support of family as opposed to queer people, but this is not bringing anybody's mom home from Italy so she can be with her family. So these families don't have to suffer trauma and tragedy and stress. And guess what? Queer Georgians also have families, and they also miss their mom who's working in Italy. And I'm going to tell you something else about Italy, southern Italy, Calabria especially. So you're positing, the West and Europe and the EU as somehow so opposed or so separate or so distinct from Georgian culture. But while I was there in the summer school in Calabria, in Italy, a member of the EU, indeed a founding member of the European community that became the EU, there was a trial going on at the court there, and it was a trial for blood revenge. A woman had been murdered by her relatives because she had broken the omerta. Like, this is connected to organized crime and everything. But this is a region where blood revenge and clan thinking is still very much a reality. And yet, like when you go to Georgia, the Georgians will tell you, well, like in some, more conservative, maybe ethnic minority corners of our country, these things still exist. The notion that we're so separate and so distinct and that we're like, you can actually clearly distinguish us and you can, put Georgia in one place and the EU and Europe into another place and they're completely separate and they have to go separate paths is an illusion. Like, we are standing in engagement and we're not, this whole issue of like, how does Georgia build its existence in this world that is becoming multipolar? Georgia, a country that has tried to play the game of the unipolar moment so well, and it didn't really work for it. That question is only relevant to me, and I think to a lot of people, and especially Georgians, as in, how will it deliver for us? How will it solve our problems? How will it free us? How will it end 30 years, an entire long generation of existential, social, and economic stress?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, at this point.
This is excellent. From a very pragmatic point of view, Pascal Lotas, how would you want to chime in? What would you like to say? Pascal is a professor in Kyoto University, just to again reintroduce him, and he specializes in neutrality studies. That's his program in Kyoto, and I would love to hear, and we all would love to hear Pascal's views on the current topic.
Well, thank you very much for that. I hope you hear me well, and
yes.
Thank you for this. And again, my apologies that I can't be there in person because I think you brought together really a fantastic panels and discussions. But on the topic that we are talking about now, what this changing period means, and I just would like to also raise this issue that we are not even sure what to call it yet. Yes, we all think of this as a move towards multipolarity, and I think that's probably correct. It just strikes me also that we still don't have a name for this period between 1990 and 2022. We've been calling that period, these 30 years, for the longest time, the post-Cold War. And somehow we all understand that post-Cold War is now over, but we still don't have a better grasp on what actually happened to us. And I think Georgia is a very is a focal point of this. It's like the changes that have been going on in all of the post-Soviet states, and of course the war in Yugoslavia too. We keep, especially in Western Europe, forgetting just how dramatic these past 30 years were, because Western Europe was undramatic, or if dramatic, then dramatic in a sense that to Western Europe felt positive, like German reunification, like the economic boom that came with it, and the especially to this part of Europe, the absence of the even the appreciation of just how hard this was for everybody east or from a certain point in Europe, including Russia and including Georgia, and the brain drain economic downturn, and of course what Almuth just said, like this mass exodus of people. And well, for slightly different reasons, I mean, even Greece is part of this story of large scale and long-term suffering, right, with many people who have left ever since 2010. And now we're in a period where all of these developments actually come to haunt again Western Europe, and they kind of come up as part of this question of where are we? And I think our colleague Glenn in his book, in one of his books, he makes this point that we still don't have a proper appreciation of the fact, the sheer geographical fact that Europe and Asia are one single thing. We are one geographical unit, and the idea that Europe and Asia are two separate things is artificial, as was what Arta earlier was like talking about. And the Georgia is of course part of this interconnection of a succession of borderlands, of krainas. And one of the tragedies of the Ukraine war is that instead of having these borderlands being a bridge between different cultures and civilizations, and interlocutors and mediators and translators and so on in order to make this compatible, what we have, unfortunately, is still this reflex of what David Gibbs was talking about, which is to have narrative and ideological dominance over everybody else, and then go to extraordinary military lengths in order to implement that, right, by force, by arms, instead of using other mechanisms and other methods that also would be available. And again, the war in Ukraine is, to me, one of the most avoidable wars of the last 100 years. This could have been de-escalated at so many points, even before 2014, even after that, even in 2022. The war that Georgia went through in 2008 could have been avoided at so many points. And luckily for Georgia, it was de-escalated after 5 days. And it still left wounds, real wounds, and these wounds are deep. And Lasha, you once made the point, nobody needs to teach the Georgians how to dislike Russians, right?
Yeah, that's right.
In a discussion that we had. But that doesn't mean that Georgia would be willing, or a majority of Georgians is willing to antagonize Russia to the point where Georgia would know that, okay, now even more is going to come. So what we're seeing at the moment, to me, is the setting in of a pragmatism in certain parts of the world, and is Georgia being one of them, like the East and Southeast Asian parts of Eurasia is another one. Like if you look at the development of ASEAN and the speech acts that are coming out of that, it's very, very pragmatic in terms of how to deal with conflict between the United States and China, but also conflict in Europe. And we're seeing that on a broader scale. We are seeing how smaller nations are just dealing with differences that Western Europe and North America still pretend to be unbreachable. 3 days ago, we've had the occurrence in Mongolia that while the Mongolian democratic process and mass protest on the street ousted the prime minister of Mongolia, because Mongolia is a very well-functioning democracy, they also had the state visit of the president of Turkmenistan and celebrated the president of Turkmenistan, who, for all intents and purposes, is a very dictatorial figure in Turkmenistan. But these states work together and they have a good rapport together. This should be impossible under this liberal mind frame. And it is not. It's very much feasible. So what we are seeing is, to me, also a sort of pragmatism that starts again to breach some of these artificial cleavages that were opened by people like Huntington and so on, that create theoretical structures, as Arta said, and well-sounding theories and so on, that in theory are absolute. But in reality, there tends to be solutions. People find solutions to problems all the time by just not being dogmatic. And my hope is that the current development that we're seeing around us works further toward this, because narrative hegemony is being lost by North America and Europe, and we're seeing a plurality of narratives and a plurality of ideas and approaches of how to deal with each other, not only taking root, but actually flourishing now. It has been taking root for the last 60, 70 years, and it is flourishing now. My hope is that we will not end up in a large-scale war of the type of, the 1940s, in order to get to then transition to a structure again that is more or less stable. And one last thing, despite what Arta said, I do think one of the things we need to appreciate is that international law and human rights are concept that we can and should criticize, but it is also something that is is not being questioned, not by China, not by Russia. I mean, international law is something that everybody actually holds quite dear. The United Nations is something that actually everybody holds dear for all its flaws and mistakes, because there are certain ideas like international law, equality of states and so on, that have a universal appeal. And I think those are integration points that will hopefully help us to not decay completely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal. Thanks. We will make sure next year you guys will be with us present. We're going to have Bryce, brief comment, right? We're gonna have Scott sort of chime in, but please, make the comment. Yeah,
I'll be brief. When you asked the question about cultural and civilizational changes, the first thing that came to mind was the recent election of Donald Trump has been seen by some people as the end of a sort of A/B test on the kind of empire that America is going to be. On one hand, you have what some people call, you mentioned liberal interventionism. Some people have called it the woke imperium. I'm not too fond of that, but I think it fits. It's basically this world where the reason that the empire is acting, the reason that the bombs are falling or that the sanctions are being added, is to help people. And for me, this has been the justification for my entire life. I was born after the Cold War, after the first Cold War, and immediately my youth was filled with the global war on terror, which was justified in numerous ways. But the one that reached me, especially in Afghanistan, was that the reason that we're there was because we are there to help Afghan women and to help the Afghan people achieve democracy. And again, falling into this pattern of refusing negotiations, that was a war that was completely avoidable in the wake of 9/11. But then, it continued. You see Libya. Why did the U.S. start bombing Libya? Well, we did it to help the people of Libya. And that turned out great, apparently. And the same thing in Syria. Why did the U.S. go into Syria? We're there to fight ISIS and help the Syrian people overthrow a dictator. Never mind the. Yeah, well, this is what I'm going at. Later on, under Trump, he was asked about why there are troops still in Syria, and he straight up said, "We're there for the oil." So that's the B to that A/B test. And more we're seeing the Trump administration and others move away from these sorts of humanitarian justifications for their actions. But meanwhile, you've already had a public that is primed to accept these justifications alongside the true realpolitik justifications. And so you have this lumbering giant that is the United States, which has two minds in it. One of the humanitarian side, one of the brutal realism side. But I think that period might be coming to sort of a close, in part because the Ukraine war really exposed a lot of the humanitarian justification as pretty shallow. American publics now have a different view, but when the war started, you had peace activists going out protesting in favor of a no-fly zone. And, I don't know if many of them knew what that meant, but they thought that the planes would simply just stop flying if it was written on paper. But what it meant in practice was that the U.S. would be shooting Russian planes out of the sky. It was the same issue in Syria. But you had peace activists going out there saying, we want more war. We want more war for peace. But as the war has progressed, the American publics, much like the Ukrainian public, is more in favor of negotiation. But the damage had already been done. Like you mentioned, that the Russians used in part a justification for the war that was totally consistent with what the U.S. called the R2P, responsibility to protect, which is what they used in Yugoslavia. But it's becoming more and more difficult to hold that position now, especially when the U.S. is supporting one of the worst atrocities in, certainly my lifetime, but probably, the entire 21st century in Gaza, where there isn't even a credible justification for security and safety. And it's where the law of the jungle has become, a completely acceptable reason for waging a brutal and terrible war. So on one hand, you have high-level American planners and thinkers moving away from this idea of humanitarian intervention and dismantling, in part, some of the apparatus that justified it with the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID. In part, it's a complicated situation. But on the other hand, you have a public, people like me who grew up, came of age in Russiagate, came of age in the closed the skies era, came of age during this time where there is a boogeyman, like there was during the Cold War, and anything that you can do to defeat that boogeyman is therefore justified, even if it means getting us closer to nuclear war. So I think this cultural shift has put us in a very difficult position as Americans, for Americans, who, even though we've all established that America doesn't control the world, but certainly we have one of the biggest sticks, and if you have the biggest stick, you get a little bit of a say. If these are the people who are going to be raised up into the global society, well, then that poses extreme challenges for actually having a world where we're collaborating with people and having a world where we're working towards solving differences, solving problems despite our differences, instead of going to war. You have that alongside this more hawkish, openly aggressive policy. Americans are going to have to figure out how to coexist with the rest of the world when everyone else seems to be moving away from that. If you look at the ideas coming out of places like China, if you look at the papers that the Chinese Foreign Ministry puts out about international cooperation, about international institutions, it's diametrically opposed to the cynical way that these institutions are being deployed by the United States. Well, that's a major contradiction. And I think that if trends persist, there's going to be a clash. One might even say a clash of civilizations, but at least a clash of worldviews. And as America's power weakens, that clash becomes more and more imminent.
One of the reasons we got together in these panels is to discover the meaning, right? What is the meaning behind these past 30 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union, in the meaning of the foreign policy of the United States, collective West? I think you touched on that quite well, so thank you so much. James.
So I think Bryce's comments are really the perfect lead-in for our next guest, who's zooming in from the great state of Texas, Scott Horton. Scott is the director of the Libertarian Institute. He's the author of the comprehensive account of the Russia-Ukraine war titled Provoked. He's the host of the Scott Horton Show, which you can find on antiwar.com. Scott, can you hear us?
I sure can. Thank you very much for having me, everyone.
Welcome.
I'll keep my remarks short and turn the discussion back over to all of you. What can I say? No offense, but Georgia's interests are just none of my affair. It's such a long way from here. I mean, I know my government has been messing around there since the 1990s, picking winners and losers, making big promises and causing lots of trouble. Keeping Russia out of their former sphere of influence was thought by Washington to be their most important goal. Under the Bill Clinton administration, it was decided that building the BTC pipeline across Georgia was the highest priority to prevent Azeri gas from flowing north through Russia or south through Iran. Under George W. Bush, it was decided that the government of Eduard Shevardnadze was too close to Russia, compromising with them over Abkhazia, making deals with Gazprom, and joining the CIS. He had to go. USAID, NED, and the rest of the regime change industry poured tens of millions of dollars in to support groups supporting Mikhail Saakashvili's rise and the Rose Revolution of 2003, which installed him in power. This included a Soros front called the Liberty Institute, not to be confused with the Libertarian Institute, I assure you. As I'm sure you all know, former President Salom Zurabichvili was born in France, not Georgia, and was just parachuted in by the new regime to take over as finance minister after the overthrow of 2003. She later explained that, quote, these institutions were the cradle of democratization, notably the Soros Foundation. The NGOs which gravitate around the Soros Foundation undeniably carried the revolution. However, one cannot end one's analysis with the revolution, and one clearly sees that afterwards, the Soros Foundation and the NGOs were integrated into power, end quote. Soros' business partner, Kaka Bendakidze, became the new economy minister. Alexander Lomaya, the director of the Open Society Georgia, was made education minister, while Giga Bokaria, co-founder of the Liberty Institute, became leader of the National Movement Party in the parliament. In the name of fighting against corruption, they stayed on Soros' payroll. Saakashvili, too. Quote, I'm delighted by what happened in Georgia, and I take great pride in having contributed to it, Soros told the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. How y'all let her become the president of your country is beyond me. Oh yeah, it's all that foreign money. I sure hope that Mr. Saakashvili's trial was more fair than his opponents got while he was in power, and that he is not being tortured in prison the way his regime tortured people. No human deserves to be treated in such a barbarian fashion. Do I believe your country is better off under the domination of Russia or any other major power? Of course not. But I do mean that American intervention in your nation is not in either of our interests. I've read that current Georgian leaders have expressed frustration that they have not been able to reach the new Trump administration to see if they can get a reset in America's Georgia policy. Be careful what you wish for. You're more likely better off when America does not have a Georgia policy at all than you would be with even a favorable one with strings attached. As far as the difficulties you may face in maintaining full independence as a small country in a world of major competing powers, and your advantageous or disadvantageous geographical position relative to important resources, I could say that at the end of the day, America will not guarantee your independence, which is why there is no major US troop presence there and why NATO membership has not moved forward since W. Bush's foolish declaration at Bucharest in 2008. Perhaps maintaining your neutrality in these major contests could be your path to maintain your independence from outright control. Even after Russia intervened to reverse Saakashvili's attempt to forcefully reintegrate South Ossetia in 2008, Moscow did not sever the BTC pipeline nor roll its tanks into Tbilisi, thank goodness. Though Putin and Medvedev had plenty of counter incentives, they certainly had the pretext to go that far if they had chosen to. President Bush, in his lame duck year, had already chosen not to intervene, despite the protests of then Vice President Cheney, who insisted on strikes against Russian forces coming through the Roki Tunnel and risking World War III. Thank goodness the cool, patient wisdom of George W. Bush, relative to Cheney anyway, prevailed that day. Surely Russia would have escalated in kind, and you would have lost your independence to the Federation after Bush inevitably backed down. Thank goodness it did not come to that. Making sure the Russians continue to feel like such a move would be unnecessary and unreasonably costly would probably be your best course of action. Of course, USAID, NED, IRI, NDI, and all the usual suspected Soros-backed groups have spent a ton to keep the current ruling party out of power. I'm sure the permanent professional protesters, analyst Brad Pierce calls it, an organized labor protest by the foreign influence industry, have some real concerns, just as I'm sure that any protester receiving the backing of a foreign regime can only be taken so seriously by anyone else. Again, ultimately, America is too far away and has too little to lose if your status was to truly change, to be truly motivated to do anything about it. When Russia came across the mountains in 2008, many Americans were terrified. They thought our Georgia was under attack, the state between South Carolina and Florida. They either had never heard of your country or they could not fathom why it being invaded should be top news in Colorado or Illinois. That Russia would attack America out of the blue seemed to them more plausible, at first glance at least. That being the case, you are almost certainly better off choosing the proper course forward for your country with that in mind. Because chances are that if worst comes to worst, no one over here is coming to intervene over there. Long live Georgia and your independence, and good luck. And may liberty always remain your highest political goal. Thank you.
Wow. Scott, you are surgical. That's why we love you. Thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it. And we're going to make sure that all three of you will show up in Georgia next year. So I do have Matthew that I owe him 5 minutes. So please continue, Matthew. And Scott, you will hang out, right, for a little bit? Or you're going to hang out with us?
Sure. And yeah, if anyone had any questions or anything like that, I'm happy to participate if y'all want.
Pascal?
And I'm sorry about my video. I don't know why it's glitching like that. I hope it's mostly acceptable.
No, you're fine. I think it was perfect. All right, Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. This is a hard act to follow. It was a great speech there. I want to try and come back to this question of meaning and how to conceptualize or understand what's happened in the last 30 years in the era of post-communism, I suppose. So a lot of the time we think about meaning, we think, oh, who are we? What have we gone through? And what do we do about it? We still live in a world of nation states, but the end of history moment didn't result in a global village and the dissolution of national identity as was expected by many. And we have a rise of civilizationalism, but not the form that Huntington foresaw. And if we talk about civilizationalism, let's give it a definition. It's a macro identity that's above local, regional, and national identity. So it's something more than nation, but it's less than the entire world. It's less than that. And it's civilizations in plural, not singular. That's civilizationalism. Its domestic political function is to legitimize a political order that involves more than one ethnic group, such as the multi-ethnic countries of Russia, Turkey, China, India. In international relations, it clearly has a function of justifying the great power ambitions of those countries, Turkey, China, Russia, India, but also reconceptualizing, giving a cultural component to understanding multipolarity. Now, the trends are clear in Turkey, China, Russia, and India. And from a Western perspective, there's an autocratic element to that. Whatever way that goes is one question. But what about Western civilizationalism? Well, as has been said yesterday, it doesn't actually exist as a unified form. There's not a single state that runs this. It's fragmented. And yesterday I said it was fragmented into two main trends. One is this liberal, global, cosmopolitan civilization, which is built on Western history and culture and liberalism, but its ambition is to spread to the entire world. It has no borders, it has no limit. The other version is what you might call a neo-traditional European civilization, a family of diverse nations with distinct cultures, histories, political systems even, their own versions of democracy, so to speak, but nonetheless they're somehow held together under an overarching idea of European civilization. But it's limited. It can't spread to Turkey. It can't spread to Morocco. It can't go any further. There's a limit to it. So if you take those two versions of what we might say Western civilizationalism, they are in conflict, it would seem. But nonetheless, on the level of the European Union, there has been a synthesis of those two distinct visions. Elements of what is set the meaning-making in Poland and Hungary have seeped in to the European Commission's liberal internationalism. And that synthesis, the product, in fact, doesn't look to have produced something good. It's produced an ugly hybrid monster, which is one of the drivers of the war in Ukraine, in spite of we all want to blame Putin 100%, but there's an element of Europe's role here which has to be discussed. Europe's role in this conflict and driving it and prolonging it, which is difficult to talk about. In Europe, I'll give you my own experience of that maybe after this event, after the panel. But I just want to say that on the one hand, the synthesis looks to have produced something not good. On the other hand, there is still the divergence. And because in the European Commission, they are conflating some of the advocates of a neo-traditional European civilization, they conflate that with populism, authoritarianism. And they are taking sides in the domestic political cleavages of countries like Romania. And they are really accelerating the culture war. And it's not clear to me that the European Commission or the European project in general is going to find a solution to the division of its civilizational identity. The trends that we're looking at the moment, the European Commission is talking about authoritarianism as a virus that's going to spread through Europe and has to be contained. And the way that they talk about, the way that they take sides in the domestic political affairs of the member states, this very difficult question of balancing sovereignty. So I was just going to wrap up by saying what's at stake here, at least in the European, I'm coming from Norway, so I want to turn the focus a little bit to Europe. And Georgia is part of Europe, obviously. And Georgia is experiencing these culture wars and this civilizational cleavage within the idea of Western civilization. But I mean, what's at stake is really democracy itself. Democratic politics inside Europe, to begin with. The complex negotiations to keep the European Union in existence, to come up with an EU defense policy, to come up with an EU migration policy and freedom of movement, to come up with the EU economic space is great, but then you have to maintain it. And to maintain it, you must allow some form of European civilizationalism to hold it together, to be a glue. Now, President Putin always talks about his idea of civilizationalism as a glue that holds together the Russian Federation. We are not going to create something similar to the Russian civilization discourse in Europe, right? But something is needed in order to organize from a social cultural perspective, how does Europe achieve peace, prosperity, security, and sovereignty, not just of the nation states that are part of the European Union, but Europe as an autonomous actor in a multipolar world. So those are my comments. Thank you.
No. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Since I already got my 5 minutes of fame, I'll keep this short. But I've noticed that Samuel Huntington's name has come up regularly, and I assume that his work, the book, first was an article and then it came out as a book, The Clash of Civilizations. Is that familiar to the Georgian audience, to the Georgian reader? Yes, I assume, good. Because I think there's two different Samuel Huntingtons. There's the one that you read about in the New York Times, and it's like the idea of what he wrote, according to liberals, which is that he advocated the domination of the Anglo-American liberal civilization over the rest of the world, and so that his point was he was advocating a clash of civilizations because he favored one particular civilization, his own. But if you actually read Samuel Huntington, the words that he actually wrote on pages, as opposed to how he's interpreted, he said precisely the opposite. And I've read it enough times that I think I can quote from memory a particular sentence from his book, which it says that this is my recollection of it. I might get a couple of words wrong, but basically he says in the book the idea that the Anglo-American liberal civilization is better than and therefore should dominate the rest of the world has three problems. It's dangerous, it's immoral, and it's wrong. So that's what Huntington actually said. And so when we talk about civilizations, the idea that is it even in Huntington, as in all of the other civilizational writers, whether it's Toynbee or even Spengler or Piotr Sorokin in Russia, et cetera, there's a long list of them. Their point is that these different civilizations, actually FSC Northrop is a forgotten one who's quite good, who should be resurrected. He was at Yale, I don't know, 70 years ago, writing about civilizations. They all agree that there's different civilizations, and they all need to be respected. And they can't simply be It's not a case, that's precisely the point, is that one of these civilizations shouldn't dominate the others. Even Huntington said that. And in Russia today, and I think in the context of this conference, I think it's important, since Russia is rather close by to Georgia, to keep in mind their perspectives on this. And civilizationalism is one of the key perspectives in Russian international affairs thought today. And as I read them, and I read them a lot, they're not talking about having Russian civilization dominate the world either. They're not doing a mirror image of Huntington either. They're saying that there should be different civilizations. Even the demonized Alexander Dugin, who does, I admit, say sometimes crazy things, but he also sometimes says interesting things. I think he's kind of realized how to get attention in the modern world is to sometimes say outrageous things. That doesn't mean that everything he says is crazy. But in any case, the Eurasianists, I just will mention in passing, want to expand beyond the sphere of Russia. Whether it's necessarily in a political imperial way depends on the Eurasianist, but that's a whole other can of worms I won't go into now.
Thank you. Just a quick comment, maybe it's a generalization. I think Art and I kind of touched on it when we first met via Zoom. We had a casual conversation. Okay, so we know what's happening. So we know the international system is shifting, right? Whether it's classic sort of from liberalism to realism, structural international relations. We're talking about now from the cultural sort of philosophical aspect of it. Is there a danger of moving into some sort of a moral relativism here? Do we have a problem potentially on the horizon? Since we're talking about sort of particularism rising, coming back. So Arta, maybe you can quickly answer that.
So I think the people who worry a lot about sort of the dangers of cultural relativism are almost by definition universalists. The way that, again, throughout most human history and ancient cultures have understood the world has been through global cultural pluralism. And that acceptance of distinction and difference allows for a different kind of a conception. Pascal rightly noted that China, Russia, and many of these civilizational actors are actually embracing the United Nations or international law. I will double down on my point by saying that they are doing so because they now have the power to be able to reinterpret the rules and the ways of interpretation, but also because they too have been, in a way, they lack, as of yet, the imagination to think of an alternative framework, because these are modern states, created in the totalizing conditions of modernity. They have internalized very similar frameworks within their regimes. So as much as this is a paradox of our time, this is why there is a certain uncertainty about what's going to follow, because we're looking at states that have become, and the world that has become more and more modernized, and democratization and liberalization are parts of that process, and yet the sources of that trend, the very basis of that trend, which was effectively the Anglo-Saxon culture, which was ideologized into a global civilizational thing, which we should call liberalism, that in itself is now unraveling because of the weight of contradictions within itself. And so that is a very different kind of a picture, and I think that's something to say. So, yeah.
Yes. And Professor Gibbs wants to talk too. So.
Yeah. I was just going to add that, Lasha, you raised the issue of moral relativism, and ultimately the issue of morality in international relations. I guess I just wanted to point out that it's perfectly possible to be a moral universalist and to take the view that certain actions, certain atrocities, certain atrocities are simply unacceptable morally, and be anti-interventionist for the simple reason that interventionism always makes these problems worse, almost invariably. Just look at the record. Just look at all the record of U.S. interventions taken on behalf of morality, moral universalism. It's been disastrous for the people who are supposed to help. My take on it is, in most cases, the best thing to do if you want to have a moral moral policy is simply not support atrocities. For example, the United States is directly supporting the mass killings going on in Gaza. The U.S. has control over that. It could stop doing that, all right, if it wants to moral foreign policy. The U.S. does not have control over what China does in Xinjiang, and therefore the idea that by imposing sanctions against the Chinese we're helping the people of Xinjiang is just an illusion for the most part. The idea that the United States is helping the people of Ukraine by prolonging the war and getting them killed by the hundreds of thousands, again, that's a very dangerous illusion. So I think basically it's nothing about moral universalism that compels interventionism. On the contrary, it would seem to me, it would argue against interventionism.
But just one point.
Yeah, please.
It's a great thing that you mentioned sort of Gaza as an example, because if you look at the realist position on this, is that if we weren't out of certain ideologies intervening already to bolster Israel to the point that we are doing in terms of special relationship, whatever, which does not have a security reason, it does not have a realist reason, it's mostly ideological, even evangelical, right? So if you don't do this, you're not distorting the regional balance of power to such an extent so that these countries can get away with it. Then you talk about the moral issue of going back in. In this case, we're not going to go back in, but in general, this is a loop that we do by not actually following realism from the first instance, and then we have to worry about the moral consequences of not following realism in the first instance. So I think realism itself is actually not just good because of a salutary effects of it, but actually has moral implications that are positive.
Paul, you want to take it?
On morality, I agree with what David Gibbs said about intervention. That was a good point, that the distinction between our helping in Libya and then the complete destruction of the state is quite striking. But for those of you who aren't American, I really distinctly remember on the eve of American intervention in Libya, that the hysterical articles in every magazine and newspaper in America about the poor Libyan people and how if we don't, all the horrors are going to come to the poor Libyan people if we don't bomb their country and destroy it. And it oddly enough, it turned out not to help them. Yeah, no, very good. But I want to make it completely, I just wanted to pat you on the back for that point, but I want to make a different point. My feeling about morality, that the focal point, if we want to have a concern about a universal appreciation for morality, is that we need to have a universal appreciation for truth. That maybe seem self-serving since I pretend to be a philosopher, but I nonetheless think it's actually the case, that the problem that we have in America and in political discourse, perhaps to some extent, undoubtedly to some extent everywhere, but in the United States, I mean, this is a theme Jeffrey Sachs mentions repeatedly, not so much in his recent talk, but his some other talks. The American government simply lies an awful lot about an awful lot of really important things. You can hear, I'm sorry. Jeffrey Sachs makes a point on this that's related. He's actually something of a philosopher, and he knows his Aristotle well, and Socrates. But the American government lies a lot. And I wrote an article 20 years ago that torture...
All governments lie, don't they, to a large extent? All governments kind of lie,
all governments lie. Yeah, John Mearsheimer wrote a terrific whole book, in a chapter in another book on lying in politics. It's something that's been done. The point is that if you lie too much about too many important things, then the truth disappears. And if the truth disappears, then how can you talk about morality? You're not even talking about reality. And how can you talk about morality if reality has disappeared? So I think, but I just one final point I wrote, as I was pointing out, an essay on torture, on the use of torture, and my conclusion is that why do we use torture? My conclusion was that we use torture in order to tell lies. You extract a confession from someone through torture to get them to say what you want them to say, not to find out what the truth is. And there's much evidence of that, but more recently, people have come to realize that torture is actually much more widespread than we think. If torture is imposition of pain on an object, nation, or person without any danger to the person giving the pain, that is also is essentially torture. And a lot of our so-called humanitarian interventions, including in Libya, there was no risk to the people bombing Libya. There's no risk to as American senators have patted themselves on the back that our proxy war with Russia in Ukraine is causing no pain to us. American soldiers aren't dying. So basically, we're torturing Russia using Ukraine as the unwitting hands in this project. That's immoral on many different grounds. But another part of the immorality is that we rarely tell the truth about how that war came about. Another thing that Jeffrey Sachs often talks about, which is why Jeffrey Sachs isn't heard on the pages of the New York Times anymore, because they can't tolerate truth.
Matthew, quickly, if you wanted to.
Yes, I just want to say something briefly about morality in international affairs. Well, I mean, it seems that part of the last 20 years have been about the weaponization of morality by immoral actors. Between, first of all, the West and Russia, but if we talk about, who wields moral authority in modern Western secular societies, politicians, lawyers, journalists, who are the moral actors, who have moral capital? It's a difficult question, it's not really the subject of this panel, but in China and Russia, the regime can say it monopolizes moral authority, and it can be a consistent actor, far more consistent than the Western countries. That's their argument, and that's the basis of this whole double standards approach, constantly exposing the West's inconsistency and immorality, and therefore degeneracy. And the ultimate litmus test of this, and of course in the West, many people think it's impossible that China or Russia could ever prove that we are more immoral than them. Mm-hmm. They're by default immoral. They're authoritarians. But the litmus test was in Ukraine, the Ukraine war. And when the question is asked to the global South audiences, who is a more immoral actor, Russia or the West? Their answer is not one or the other. We are agnostic, or we don't know. We're not taking sides. So I just think this whole topic is really important. But how do we get out of it? We have the answer, the UN Charter. We have to find some common moral principles, just like I believe in Europe, in the Westphalian period, the concert of powers, certain principles emerged, such as you had to write a declaration before you waged war on your neighbor, and certain conventions. We'll have to come back to these basic things, but this is a really important topic.
Right. Okay, thank you. We're going to open up to the audience now. We have a few minutes left, maybe 15 minutes or so. Yes, was it you, Almut?
Yeah, I wanted to add something to this discussion of morality. I mean, because it hasn't been said yet sufficiently, I think, and that is that, following on Matthew's comment about, like Ukraine was the moment when we could decide who is a moral actor and who isn't. I would argue Gaza is that moment. Like, it is in such stark clarity that, after Gaza, there's really, nobody can in any way claim to represent superior morality in this world. But I also wanted to speak about something more in general. Like, this is a conversation about Georgia, and it's taking place in Georgia, at least for the people there on the stage. And I think it's, it's nice to have sort of like a neat theoretical conversation about juxtaposing universalism and nationalism. But we shouldn't forget a reality, and that is that for the entire period of the West's very intense engagement with Georgia in the last 35 years, it has actually, in the name of Western values and democracy and freedom, endorsed an increasingly jingoist ethno-nationalist Georgian vision, right? And like over the years, this has gotten stronger and stronger and more pronounced. In the 1990s, via the OSCE and via the UN, you could still have Western governments engaging on the issue of Georgia's ethno-nationalist conflicts in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia in a fairly, constructive and reasonable and sensible way. And even in 2008, I mean, famously after the war with Russia, the European Union commissioned a report, the Taliafero report, which found in all clarity that it was Georgia that started this war. And within about not even a decade, the European Union completely reversed its position on that. It had on hand a report that stated the facts, and yet, moved 10 years on, and basically, like, now the position is, well, Russia attacked Georgia, and everybody says that with this great face. So the more intensely Georgia was engaged and sort of integrated in the name of democracy, in the name of Western values into the West, the more a sort of a really crusty, blood and soil, primordialist Georgian nationalism was endorsed and was espoused. And like, this is also something, we can't tell neat linear stories here, because we always like sort of, they clash and run into each other when we then look at reality. And I think it's very interesting in the run-up to the election in Georgia last year in fall, the then Georgian leader, and now again Georgian leader, or like head of the leading party, went out and created this big scandal where he says, actually maybe we should apologize to the Ossetians for the things that we've done to them. And everybody was like, a lot of people were shocked, and a lot of people were like, oh my God, actually he's right. And a lot of people were like, wow, this is interesting. And it was interesting, but I also want to say it was an opportunistic, sort of gratuitous gesture, because we have seen no follow-up on it. It has not led to a renewed critical introspective engagement of like, where did these conflicts in the 1990s actually come from? And how can we have an honest conversation about it?
Okay, so questions.
George Guimradze, we met a lot of you guys. So thanks a lot to the organizers for this very wonderful discussions. And during these 2 days, we had really very great discussions. We had a lot of great ideas told here. But it got me afraid, got me a fear somehow, whether we are building our own bubble where this discussion is going on, etc. I mean, my question is about the next step, what we can do. Because, for instance, the Pascal is here, who is doing a wonderful job to popularize these kind of issues, these kind of ideas, and etc. Here is a Glen Dizen, here is a Alexander Mercouris, who is doing a good job on the YouTube platforms and other social media platforms. But what do you feel is our next step? How can we make this kind of discussions? That the mainstream outside us, outside of this room, is quite antagonist to this kind of discussions. And how can we make these ideas mainstream? What shall we do more?
Sorry, I will add. So we had private discussions, and I will not say something new. We have discussed already, but I wanted to tell loudly my opinion, first of all, and the question which is related to first question. Thank you, first of all, for your visiting. Thanks a lot to Lasha Kastradze, who was main person who did this great job in Georgia. We are very glad, and we love, we are the nation of hospitality. We love guests, and especially the guests who arrive with thoughtful minds and the spirit of sincere friendship. So I have made some notes not to lose the idea. My notes related to that regardless of how much we discuss or debate, I firmly believe that everything in the world unfolds with a certain order, aligned with the level of consciousness humanity is ready to embrace. I am deeply convinced that everything happens in order, and in spite of our ideas the nation is ready for. So these events we experience are a reflection of our inner state. Systems exist precisely for the purpose to reveal who we truly are and where we genuinely stand. In a world where money and power dictate the distribution of influence, the pressing question remains, what is the solution and where can it be found? Where do we draw the line between science-oriented principle and the will to remain a part of the global order? So, to be science-or, to be self-determined nation, it's good. But to act independently and not to consider itself as a member of the world order, it's another thing. So where do you see the outcome?
In Georgia, EU is sanctified and Western civilization, so to speak. So when Levin said in one of his public speeches that what he was thinking about the, EU and all that, he said that, you cannot sanctify European Union. I mean, we're part of the larger union of Christ, and of course he was crucified by the Georgian liberals. So the part of not so much, in Georgia it's very specific, it's not just morality in general, but it's the religion as part of our politics, just like it is in Serbia and Russia. So, I don't think you can really come up with anything that does not take, I'm talking about the new foreign policy doctrine or whatever, without factoring the religion in, while Europe is completely, the religion is not part of the politics. So how do you think that we can factor that in, or how do you think, is it at all viable? Or maybe we're talking about not so much democracy anymore, but constitutional monarchy, perhaps. Do you have any thoughts on that? Thank you. It's a little bit of a stretch, I understand, but I still wanted maybe to hear some remarks on that topic. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Leon Gignashvili. I'm at Tbilisi State University. There are two things. One thing is European values, as we call it, like Western values, which are by and large adhered by all Georgians. I mean, because the Georgian, Georgian idea, which was formed in 19th century by Ilya Ceaușescu, was that nothing national has the value unless it has also the all humanity inclusive value, so to say. So the very Georgian identity was formed in openness towards the world great things, like it was Greek culture, for instance, in ancient times, or when Christianity. So Georgians knew that they're part of the big world, and they should embrace all the best things which are in this world. And then this European culture also became such thing. Since 18th century, Georgians understood that this great project of enlightenment, this emancipation of personality, like the very formation of the importance of human individual conscience, that is European values. And Georgians mostly adhere to them as their own own values somehow. But the other thing is European institutions that purport by and large now to present those values. And you see the discrepancy because they do not really follow themselves those values. And they seem to be doing it, but on the contrary, they're doing the very opposite. Because they're, in the name of European values, they're simply crushing here the, truth, factuality, distort the facts, and foment revolutionary processes where they should not do it. And this is a problem. I think it's not that European values are kind of parochial values and they can be substituted. I don't think European values, as we understand it in Georgia by and large, and in its deep sense, are parochial values. They're all humanity inclusive values. European values is individual dignity that was endorsed by this great process which happened after Renaissance, Enlightenment. That cannot be rescinded. It is now humanity exists with these values. And it's humanity's values. It's Chinese values also, and Indian values also. India and China cannot live without those values anymore, I think. But when concrete institutions and concrete persons, as if incorporating those values, are acting opposite to them, then that creates a great problem. And Euroscepticism can grow from these instances. Thank you.
So should we just answer first and then, right? Yeah, okay.
It's also directly tied into the question of how do we do those next steps in the context of a world where money and power are everything, and conversations like this are stigmatized and not accepted by a lot of the mainstream, especially in the United States. I think those two questions are very tied. One of the things that I would suggest as next steps, or one of the arenas that I think is most important, is young people. The way that someone is socialized to a certain ideology or a set of ideas, or some idea about morality, usually happens in their early years. I think of all the things that I thought were true, I thought were important when I came in to an undergrad program, and thinking about the change when it came out. And especially having seen friends that I was in college with grow up who had different ideologies, you can see what they start to do. Like I've had friends who, I mentioned earlier that Russiagate was the dominant political thing going on during my undergrad. I came to undergrad in 2016, right before Trump got elected. And a lot of people internalized it. A lot of people internalized that Russia was an enemy and that America had to spread democracy in order to prevent the authoritarians from taking over the world. And that flows into their politics. Now some of them are working for Congress people who are implementing some of the hawkish policies that everyone in here would oppose. So I think the place to intervene, or the place that can be intervened with, is the universities. Some sort of outreach where people like you all have a chance to engage and debate on stages in front of undergrads who think they have a formed ideology, but they don't. And so, that builds the stage for organizing. Like the only way anything good has ever happened in this world is because a bunch of people got together and, organized, made a plan to get it done. And that's even true in the face of overwhelming money and power. Like the richest people in the world can do very little if, everyone else is actively working against them. And right now, the most powerful people, some of the most powerful people in the world, are the people who are driving these wedges inside of, throughout the whole world, but driving wedges in between East and West Ukraine, driving wedges between Georgia. It takes active organizing. Active neutrality is, it's a process. It's not something that just happens. So I think organizing more spaces where younger people can be exposed to alternative ideas, and so that pot can start cooking a lot more, I think will be essential for any organizing for peace and justice and global neutrality.
One thing that we haven't really thought about as much is that what's happening, the sort of the unraveling of the international system and the unraveling of the international order that we have been witnessing is structural, and it will happen irrespective of what we like or think or what our ideology is. So I think this is a time, more than any other time, to be open to different ideas and not sanctify or sacralize certain concepts. Whether it's the EU or it's the UN, we have to understand that the history of the world and the history of humanity for the longest time had a lot of room for peace and diplomacy and negotiation. It's not like we discovered peace and diplomacy after the post-war years. And so there is so much to think through those ideas and go with that. And lastly, I want to sort of just, something that Almut said is very important, and I don't think we mentioned it enough during this conference, which is the way that we're talking about civilizations, we're talking about nations, they are different categories, and throughout the 20th century and really the late 19th century, the idea that America had and Wilsonianism really is about using nationhood, ethno-national identity, to go after civilizational realms and civilizational powers. So pitting nations, small nations against big civilizations has been a policy of the United States for decades. And it's about time for us to change that. And it's very important, I think, for historic nations like Georgia to be aware of this and not put themselves in line to move towards an ethno direction in such a way that they could be abused for an anti-civilizational project by the sort of the imperial powers or the universalist powers. Thank you.
Since we're on the topic of what can be done to change the situation politically, the sort of, shall we say, the pro-war consensus in the West, including in my country, the United States, I suppose I would address the issue of the decline of a peace movement in the United States and also in Western Europe. A very striking thing is that the political left, when I was in college in the 70s and in graduate school in the 1980s, that was where anti-interventionism was. It was synonymous with being on the left, which is now, as I see it, the left has become pro-war in some ways, much more pro-war than the right. You're getting also Orwellian situations where you have quote-unquote peace activists demanding a no-fly zone over Russia, as Bryce Green noted. The irony, the almost Orwellian character of that is very striking, but nevertheless, here we are. Something else I suppose we're seeing is something of a realignment in the United States, and that's reflected in the excellent discussion given by Scott Horton, who's a libertarian. A libertarian one normally thinks of as being on the right. What I'm hearing from Scott Horton today, and what I've seen on his publications on antiwar.com, is strongly anti-interventionist, making a lot of the same arguments, almost identical arguments to what the left used to say back in the day, what people like Noam Chomsky have been saying over many decades, from somebody who's a libertarian. I think that what needs to be done here is to point out to people on the left how corrupted they have become and how far they have strayed away from the original anti-war position they've taken, to sort of recreate a more authentic peace movement, one that will really have influence and be able to sort of block these destructive policies that we've been seeing.
Okay, thank you. Paul.
I think, if I understood your question, that how does something so particular as the Orthodox religion in Georgia, how does it become part of the conversation in a world where that seems like a very particularist perspective? Is that correct? And the answer, part of the answer, it has to do with two philosophers, again, Simone Weil, whom my center is named after, and the Russian philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, because both of them saw Greek thought, which is based on reason and is accessible to everyone, in its own terms, as being echoed in a different poetic form in Christianity. And Simone Weil wrote a whole series on intimations of Christianity in ancient Greek thought. And the founder of Russian philosophy, Vladimir Solovyov, thought that the very essence of European civilization was precisely the fact that it combines the tradition of revelation from traditions such as Christianity and Greek thought, which is based on reason, which is universally accessible. And unfortunately, it's precisely that Europe which seems to have disappeared, but that Europe as an idea still exists. And I think that needs to be resurrected. And one way to do that, and this might be a concrete action, would be to make sure that there's re-editions, including in Georgian, or new translations if necessary, into the case of Simone Weil, of their work. Finally, if anyone wants to help us set up a Simone Weil Center in Tbilisi, I'm all open to your ideas. We could have seminars in coffee shops with young people taking up Bryce's idea and do fun things, and I think that might be really...
there is plenty of coffee shops in Tbilisi, but not too much philosophy going on in those coffee shops, but we're going to have to bring some philosophy in coffee shops, and we are kind of missed on this the whole thing of the whole concept of so classical Europe, classical liberalism that you quite often hear, but maybe next time. Matthew has some really brief comments,
very brief,
and then that's it. And then Vakhtang will do the closing remarks, and we're finished.
Yeah, just about this not building a bubble, but you moving forward and keeping the ideas. In a crisis, you need dialogue. If the body's in crisis and you're having a heart attack, you need your brain and your nervous system has to cooperate and have a dialogue to solve the problem. We need dialogue. So amongst academics, we have our job to have dialogue and to bring the disciplines together, and to also, we have to include more women in the next event, of course, because it's all men, it seems, in our panels, as Almut very fairly pointed out. But we also have to think about the young people and other stakeholders, because that's also what we need to include in the future events. And I could go on with these ideas, but of course the most important thing I think is also to include perhaps Armenia and Azerbaijan, people from there, because there's similar problems, there's similar stories, there's things that can be brought out of the commonality, the comparisons. But of course the Georgian view, I want to make it very clear that I wish I had seen more of the Georgian view, because it seemed like you were all depending on us to give you ideas, but we get ideas from you. It's definitely true. Georgia is a small country, but very complex and diverse, and it's not monolithic, and there's other parts of the Georgian view that I hope I will still get a chance to see as I'm here. But we don't want to build a bubble, and we also want to include people that don't agree, but the ones who behave themselves like normal people when they debate, and that's part of the struggle as well, to actually have progress. Thank you.
There is the window to the future from this point on. Pascal, did you have something to say? We just keep adding little by little.
10 seconds. Dr. Mamradze.
Okay, go ahead.
Look, Dr. Mamradze, please look east and look south. The ideas that are being discussed here, they will be fought by Western Europe and by North America, but they will fall on fertile ground if you reach out to Ulaanbaatar, to Mongolia, and to connect the Ulaanbaatar dialogue with this forum here, or if you reach out to Indonesia, to Jakarta, to the foreign ministry, and say, like, we want a debate with you, and to South Africa, this would have huge potential. So instead of fighting bad ideas in the West, I would say, like, let's build better ideas and forums with the East and the South.
Excellent, excellent. Almut. Thank you very much. Scott, do you have just 2 seconds? 2 seconds. Can you put together like a paragraph into 2 seconds?
Yeah, sure. I guess just real quick, I would say thank you all again very much for having me here today. And I would suggest that you guys build up your free market economy as best as you possibly can, so as to provide as many good jobs as possible so that people don't have to resort to working for foreign NGOs.
There you go. Perfect. Thank you so much. This was great, guys. Thank you very much. And Vakhtang will do the closing comments.
Ქალბატონებო და ბატონებო, ძვირფასო სტუმრებო, მინდა უღრმესი მადლობა გადაგიხადოთ ყველა თქვენგანს აღნიშნულ ფორუმში მონაწილეობისთვის. როგორც დამწყე საზოგადოებას, ასევე ჩვენს ძვირფას პანელისტებს, ჩვენს ძვირფას სპიკერებს. ისინი იყვნენ ონლაინ თუ ადგილზე, რა თქმა უნდა, განსაკუთრებით დასაფასებელია და მადლობა ყველას, ვინც ადგილზე ჩამოვიდა, თუმცა ვიცი, რომ ბატონ პასკალს ასევე უნდა და ადგილზე ჩამოსვა და მას გარკვეულმა სხვა ფაქტორებმა შეუშალა ხელი. იმედი მაქვს, რომ შემდეგ წელს შევხვდებით თბილისში და შემდეგ ღონისძიებაზეც ჩვენ გვექნება თანამშრომლობის საშუალება. ასევე უღრმესი მადლობა ქალბატონ ალმუტს, ბატონ ჰორტონს ძალიან შესანიშნავი გამოსვლისთვის, რომელიც მას ჰქონდა დღეს, ძალიან ესეთი შთამბეჭდავი და ამაღელვებელი სიტყვისთვის. მინდა აღვნიშნო, რომ ჩვენ მქონდა 19 პანელი, პირველი ძირითადი პანელის შემდეგ გუშინ ნაშუა დღეს ჯამში 19 პანელის ფარგლებში მონაწილეობა მიიღო 100-ზე მეტმა სპიკერმა. ჩვენ მიმოვიხილეთ როგორც გეოპოლიტიკის საკითხები, ასევე მდგრადი განვითარების ისეთი ასპექტები, როგორიც არის ჯანდაცვა, თქვათ ბავშვთა დამოკიდებულება გაჯეტებზე და რეკრეაციული სივრცეების გავლენა ამ ყველაფერთან კონკურენციაში, ვიმსჯელეთ სივრცითი მოწყობის დეტალებზე, ყველაფერზე იმაზე, რაც გავლენას ახდენს მდგრად განვითარებაზე, მაგრამ პირობითად სიღარიბის შემცირებაზე, ან ღირსეულ სამუშაო ადგილზე, ან კლიმატის ცვლილებებზე, ჰაერის დაბინძურებაზე საუბარი უბრალოდ საცილო ხდება, თუ ჩვენ არ გვაქვს მშვიდობა. თუ ჩვენ თავზე გვაწვიმს ბომბები, აქ ყველაფერ დანარჩენზე საუბარი არის ზედმეტი. თუმცა მაშინ როცა არის მშვიდობა, უკვე შენიწყებ ფიქრს იმაზე, რომ მაგალითად რამდენად არის უზრუნველყოფილი პირობითად სიცოცხლის უფლება, თუ კი ჯანდაცვა არ არის ხელმისაწვდომი და ხარისხიანი. რამდენად არის არჩევანის თავისუფლება უზრუნველყოფილი, თუ არ გაქვს ხელმისაწვდომი და ხარისხიანი განათლება. და განათლებით რამდენად არის ჩვენი არჩევანი თავისუფალი. მაგრამ ამ ყველაფრის საფუძველი, რა თქმა უნდა, კიდევ და კიდევ ის, რაც ბოლო პერიოდში მსოფლიოში გეოპოლიტიკაში არის ყველაზე წამყვანი, ეს არის კიდევ და კიდევ მშვიდობა. საკითხი, რომელიც სამწუხაროდ გახდა დღის წესრიგის მთავარი თემა და ფაქტობრივად 10 წლეულებია ბირთვულ საფრთხეებზე არ ყოფილა საუბარი, თუმცა ბოლო პერიოდში ვხვდებით უამრავ ანალიტიკურ შეფასებებს ამ კუთხითაც, რაც უკვე ცუდია და ძალიან დიდი პრობლემურია. მე გეოპოლიტიკის ნაწილზე არ გადავალ, უბრალოდ მე კიდევ ერთხელ გავუსვამ ხაზს, რომ მეც ვარ ამაყი იმით, რომ ჩვენმა პატარა ერმა გაუწია წინააღმდეგობა გარკვეულ უზარმაზარ სისტემას, უზარმაზარ მანქანას არჩევანის თავისუფლებაში, რომ ჩვენ არ გვინდა სუიციდი. ჩვენ გვინდა ვიცხოვროთ მშვიდად, ვიცხოვროთ განვითარებაზე ორიენტირებით, ვიცხოვროთ კულტურაზე ორიენტირებით. ჩვენი სტუმრები გუშინ იმყოფებოდნენ თბილისის ოპერაში, დაისზე, რაც იყო ძალიან საამაყო ჩემთვისაც ისეთი შესანიშნავი წარმოდგენა, რომელიც გუშინ ვიხილეთ და ბოლო პერიოდში ფაქტობრივად ყველა მაკროეკონომიკური მაჩვენებლებით ეს არის უმუშევრობა, მთლიანი შიდა პროდუქტი ერთსულზე, სიღარიბის მაჩვენებლები, ეს ყველაფერი ამ მომენტში, ამ ეტაპზე არის საქართველოში რეკორდულ მაჩვენებლებზე. თუმცა არანაირად ეს ყველაფერი არ ნიშნავს იმას, რომ ჩვენ კმაყოფილები ვართ და ჩვენ ვფიქრობთ, რომ არაფერი გასაკეთებელი არ არის. უამრავი ადამიანი ჯერ კიდევ სიღარიბეშია და მანამ სანამ ყველა ადამიანი არ იქნება საკმარისი ლუკმაპურით და საკმარისი რესურსებით, რომ მას კონდეს ხარისხიან განათლებასა და ჯანდაცვაზე წვდომა, ჩვენ არ ვიქნებით კმაყოფილი ხელისუფლება და მთავრობა. ჩვენი პასუხისმგებლობაა ვიზრუნოთ ყველაზე და ყველას კონდეს თანაბარი შესაძლებლობები. ამავდროულად ფორუმი ეძღვნება უმეტესწილად გეოპოლიტიკური საკითხების გარდა ადგილობრივ ხელისუფლებებს და დღესობით მსოფლიოში 8.3 მილიარდი ადამიანიდან დაახლოებით 55%, 4.5 მილიარდ ადამიანზე მეტი ცხოვრობს ქალაქებში. 70%-მდე გაიზრდება ეს მაჩვენებელი 2025 წლისთვის. და რაც დრო გავა, უფრო და უფრო მეტად მნიშვნელოვანი იქნება ქალაქების მუნიციპალიტეტების როლი მსოფლიო ეკონომიკაში. და უფრო მეტი ფასი ექნება დაშვებულ შეცდომებს ადგილობრივ ხელისუფლებაში ქალაქის დონეზე, იმიტომ რომ მაგალითად შედარებისთვის რო ავიღოთ, თუნდაც შანხაის ეკონომიკა დაახლოებით 700 მილიარდზე მეტია და მხოლოდ ბიუჯეტი აქვს დაახლოებით 106 მილიარდი. თბილისი, რა თქმა უნდა, ბევრად ნაკლებია, თუმცა როცა ევროპაში გამოდივართ ხოლმე სიტყვით, მაინც მასშტაბებზე კიდე ისეთ არ ვფიქრობთ, რომ პატარა ქალაქი ვართ, მაგრამ აზიური მასშტაბებით ეს ყველაფერი კიდევ სხვანაირად ჩანს. იგივე პარიზი დაახლოებით 1100 წლისთვის მოსახლეობით იყო დაახლოებით 3000 კაცი. 200 წლის შემდეგ იყო დაახლოებით 200.000 კაცი, დაახლოებით იგივე რაც ბათუმი არის ახლა. ლონდონი იმავდროულად იყო 80.000, მაგრამ დღესდღეობით გვაქვს ქალაქები, რომელიც არის დაახლოებით 37 მილიონი, 33 მილიონი. ამიტომ აი ამ ყველაფერს ადგილობრივად სწორი გადაწყვეტილებების მიღებას აქვს უნიშნულოვანესი როლი, მაგრამ ეს ყველაფერი ვერ შედგება თუ არ გვექნება კიდევ იმის საშუალება, რომ მშვიდ გარემოში, ომის გარეშე, მილიტარიზაციის გარეშე ვიმჟელოთ და ვიმუშაოთ უსაფრთხოებაზე. უღრმესი მადლობა მინდა მოვახსენოთ ჩვენ ზვირფას სტუმრებს, რომლებიც აქ იმყოფებიან, რომლებიც დარბაზში იმყოფებიან, რომლებიც ნაწილი უკვე თავიანთი გამოსვლების შემდეგ წავიდნენ. თქვენ ხართ პირდაპირ მინდა გითხრათ ვარსკვლავები, რომ თქვენ შეიძლება არ იცოდეთ ამის შესახებ, მაგრამ ჩვენი მოსახლეობას და მსოფლიოში უამრავი ადამიანი გისმენთ, გიყურებთ თქვენი YouTube არხებიდან, სიამოვნებით გაკვირდებით და მათ შორის ვსწავლობთ თქვენგანაც. მაგრამ ჩვენც გვაქვს პრეტენზია იმაზე, რომ ჩვენც რაღაცეები შეგვიძლია, ჩვენც ვართ საინტერესო ერი და ჩვენი კულტურა, ჩვენი განათლება, ჩვენი შესაძლებლობებიც არის ისეთი, რომელსაც ჭირდება დამატებითი შეფასებები, კიდევ უფრო მეტი საშუალებები იმისა, რომ განვითარდეთ და დრო, როგორც წესი, ყველაფრის მკურნალია. გარკვეული ტექნოლოგიები იძლევა იმის საშუალებას, რომ თუკი ადრე შეიძლება და 10 წლეულები ჭირდებოდა გარკვეული სერვისების მიღებას ადგილზე, მაგალითად, თუნდაც სოფის ვაქცინა, რომელიც 1895 წლისკენ გამოიგონეს პარიზში პასტერმა და პეტერბურგიდან დაკმენილი ადამიანები ჩადიოდნენ, რომ გადაერჩინათ თავი ცხენებით და ასე შემდეგ. დღეს ყველას ხელმისაწვდომი აქვს ეს ყველაფერი, ისევე როგორც ინფორმაცია შეგიძლია წამის მიეთეთში მიიღო და გამოიყენო. ყველა დაღლილები ვართ ძალიან ხანგრძლივი გამოსვლების შემდეგ. თქვენს ამხელა მოთმინებისთვის, ვინც დარბაზში ხართ, მინდა კიდევ ერთხელ გადაგიხადოთ მადლობა და ჩვენს ონლაინ სპიკერებთანაც ძალიან დიდი იმედი მაქვს, რომ გულიმწყდება უბრალოდ რომ ვერ გიმასპინძლეთ ისე როგორც უმასპინძლეთ ჩვენს ადგილზე მყოფ სპიკერებს, ვერ გაჩვენეთ ქართული სტუმართმოყვარეობა, რომელიც ჩვენთვის საამაყოა და ძალიან ვაფასებთ ამ ყველაფერს. გემშვიდობებით ჩვენ ამით დახურულად ვაცხადებთ დღევანდელ ფორუმს და შევიკრიბებით 1 წლის შემდეგ. მადლობა ყურადღებისთვის.